Immediately after this terrible tragedy, Brian Masterson, the owner of Infabco, who the company responsible for the commercial diving operations on the Wildrake, stood on the deck of the Wildrake and ordered the divers who had just recovered the bodies of their two colleagues to continue their work at 522 feet or 159 meters. Richard Walker is 32. He's got a wife, Jean, and a 15-month-old daughter, Marissa, who he absolutely adores. He also has a stressful and dangerous job, but that part of his life he really just doesn't talk about much because he doesn't want to worry Jean. So, on the 26th of July 1979, he packs his bag for his next work trip and flies almost 24 hours from the US to Aberdeen in Scotland. That same month, work started to reinstall the buoy and reinstate the SALM in the Thistle oil field situated between Scotland and Norway. On the 29th of July, two American saturation divers, 32-year-old Richard Walker and 28-year-old Victor Giel, entered the saturation habitat on the diving support vessel, the Wildrake, and they began their pressurization procedures to a working depth of around 160 meters or 520 feet. The Wildrake is a deep water saturation diving vessel equipped with a helipad to fly in crew and supplies, a saturation habitat and dive bell where the divers live and work for about 28 days and maintain their working pressure, a crane to lower the dive bell into the water, and a moon pool, which is an opening in the center of the ship so the dive bell can be lowered from the deck through the hull of the ship and directly into the water. The SALM, which they're installing, is a single anchor leg mooring, which is a system that allows a ship to dock to the oil pipeline and load oil into their tanks. It's a block weighted to the seabed and a riser that's connected to a floating buoy at the surface. This system forms a pipeline connected to the oil drilling rig so that the ship doesn't have to get too close to the drilling rig in order to receive its load. The SALM serving the Thistle oil field was installed in March 1977 at a cost of around $6.5 million. It didn't go into operation until February 1978, but by October 1978, there were already problems. The buoy had started to shear a pin and shackle setup that connected the riser, and the buoy was disconnected using an explosive charge and then taken away for repair. The explosion also damaged the riser. Despite there being a moon pool, the dive bell had been modified to swing over the side of the ship. During these modifications, the swivel that connects the bell to the crane wire was replaced with two shackles. The clump weight was also removed because it couldn't clear the side of the ship when the crane swung out. The clump weight is a large, heavy weight hanging from the bottom of the bell, which serves as ballast and to hold the bell facing downwards and make sure that it's negatively buoyant. The bell also has 4 drop weights tied by rope, which gives it enough weight to descend, but without the clump weight it's slightly lighter and wouldn't put as much strain on the shackles attaching the bell to the hoist wire. On the night of the 7th of August, the dive bell, along with Richard and Victor, was hoisted over the side of the Wildrake. Their mission for the night was to continue the operation of attaching the SALM riser to its base. As the bell was lowered into the water, the bell's transponder came loose. So Brian Masterson ordered the Wildrake's foreman just to cut it off. A transponder is like a GPS system, which in this case is used underwater to locate the bell if it were to go missing. Of course, the bell was attached to the ship's crane, and so perhaps it didn't seem too important. Richard and Victor got to work at 148 meters or around 485 feet. For a number of hours, Richard worked on reattaching the riser while Victor provided support from within the dive bell. But at 2:20 in the very early hours of the morning of the 8th of August, Richard looked back at the bell And to his dismay, he saw that the bell was listing or leaning over to its side. He came closer to inspect and found that the bell was no longer attached to the lift wire. It was hanging precariously with all its weight on the umbilical. The umbilical is a set of service wires and pipes that provide breathing gas, hot water to keep the divers warm, and communications with the Wildrake. The shackles attaching the bell to the hoist wire had come loose, and now the hoist wire had drifted out of sight. Richard relayed his findings to the surface, and then he and Victor began preparing for an emergency rescue. First, he strapped the diving bell's exterior hatch, which opens outwards, to the outside of the bell in an open position. Without the clump weight, which would have created some space between the seabed and the hatch if the bell were to drop into the sand at the bottom of the sea, the outer hatch would be open, and so the divers would probably still be able to dig their way out. Richard then climbed back inside the bell to join Victor. They then closed and sealed the interior hatch, which opens into the bell. Sealing this dive bell is really all that stands between life and death for these two divers. They can't just swim up to the surface from 500 feet. First off, they wouldn't be able to hold their breath because air in their lungs would be expanding as they ascend. And more importantly, they're saturated with gas at a higher pressure than at the surface. And to ascend to the surface pressure safely is going to take them around 6 days. Any quicker is a death sentence. So they need to stay inside the pressurized diving bell. Water temperatures in the North Sea are between 9 and 16 degrees Celsius or 48 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. For divers in a lost bell, the single biggest immediate danger is hypothermia. So it was some comfort to Richard and Victor that they still had the umbilical cord to provide hot water, breathing gas, and of course they could still talk to the ship. Nonetheless, they started their preparations for survival as if they were completely cut off. First, Richard dried himself off, and then he crawled into his survival bag. And then he gathered his supplies like water and food into his survival bag and found as comfortable a position as he could. Then he got his carbon dioxide scrubber ready and pulled that into the bag with him. At those depths, the divers will have a breathing mixture containing helium. Helium conducts heat really well, and so most of their heat loss will be through their breathing. To combat that heat loss, the diver's CO2 scrubber has a heat exchange built into the system, which means as they breathe through the system, the CO2 will be scrubbed, and in that chemical reaction that absorbs the CO2, it also creates heat. That heat is then used to warm their breathing gas, and so they breathe a warm mixture which will help to slow their heat loss. Finally, Richard helps Victor go through the same procedure. The two men then hunker down and wait, hoping that rescue comes before they succumb to hypothermia. As they wait, Richard starts to think about his wife and daughter back in America. A representative from the company has been sent to notify them that there is an incident. But everything's okay because they'll soon hoist them up using the umbilical cord. The ship lets the divers know that's what's happening, and so they breathe a sigh of relief. But in the back of Richard's mind, he's wondering how they're going to pull that off given the fact that the umbilical is not certified and might not have been engineered to withstand the weight of the bell. Then he calms his nerves, says to himself that everything's going to be okay. They don't have the clump weight, and he's sure that by the time they get closer to the surface, they can send a surface diver down to connect the ship's crane to the bell and hoist the bell out of the water. Back at the surface, they start to winch in the reel and the umbilical cord, but it quickly becomes trapped while it's being coiled onto its spool. In the process, they slightly damage the umbilical. But Richard and Victor have still got hot water, they've still got breathing gas, and they've still got communication with the surface. So they switch tactics and shift the umbilical from its own winch onto the ship's crane. Richard and Victor almost immediately start to radio up to the ship, but their communications are now weak and crackly. Eventually, the ship's able to make out that the situation has gone from bad to worse. Richard and Victor no longer have hot water or breathing gas and the radio wire has been badly damaged. The weight of the bell, coupled with the damage from the bell's umbilical winch, have severed the gas and hot water. Richard and Victor's lives are now literally hanging by a thread. If the clock hadn't started yet, it now just kicked into overdrive. The only thing the ship could do was to lower the bell onto the seafloor. And that was at about 159 meters or 522 feet deep. They then called in their sister ship, the Stena Wilder. The Stena Wilder's dive bell was in the middle of repairs, and so it had to be quickly prepared to dive to those depths. Just after 6 o'clock in the morning, the Stena Wilder's bell is lowered into the water with rescue divers Phil Casey Smith and Eddie Frank. The plan is to attach a guide wire to the bell and then hoist the bell up using the Wildrake's crane. Now this is when the catalogue of failures starts to compound. In an emergency rescue, very often time is your greatest enemy. The quicker you rescue someone, the higher their chances of a full recovery or even survival. Time was not on Richard and Victor's side. They're fighting the cold and have a limited supply of breathing gas. Their window is closing fast, and as quickly as the clock is ticking, so too are the problems adding up. The dive bell on the Stena Wilder is having problems of their own. Their lights are out of order and their communication system is acting up, which is slowing the divers down. The transponder from the Wildrake is lying useless on the deck of the Wildrake, so the rescue divers are having a hard time even finding the lost bell. It doesn't help that in the stress of the emergency, the Wildrake didn't keep track of where they dropped the bell after they attempted to raise it using its now severed umbilical cord. At 7:55, Phil finally finds Richard and Victor and got a very excited thumbs up from the two men. Richard again breathes a sigh of relief. Rescue was there and they would soon be back on board. Another hour went by while Phil wrestled the guide wire around the SALM base. The Stena Wilder doesn't have dynamic positioning, which means the ship's captain had to hold the vessel in position, manually steering, adjusting the throttle forward and aft, and using the bow thruster to point the bow of the vessel. Of course, this is in the North Sea, which isn't exactly a calm lake, and so the captain is fighting as hard as he can to keep the ship in position through a series of over and under corrections in rough seas. For the rescue divers below, they're getting dragged back and forth by their umbilical cord every time the ship loses position. At 9 o'clock, Phil finally attaches the guide wire and radios up for the Wildrake to lower its crane hook. But the hook lands too far from the lost bell and the slings are too short for the guide wire to reach. So the hook is hauled back on board and extra lengths of slings are attached. Just after 10 o'clock, Phil's able to attach the crane hook to the bell. That's really just in time because Richard and Victor are now frantic to get to the surface. They've been in ice cold waters for over 12 hours and more than half of that time has been without fresh breathing gas or hot water or communication with the surface. Richard feels like he's on a roller coaster ride where rescue seems imminent only to have his hopes dashed when a new problem sets in. He's also becoming hypothermic, but he's relieved. They're attached to the ship again and soon they'll be back on board. The Wildrake starts to wind in the crazed hoist, but the bell is not directly beneath the Wildrake, and so they start to pull and it gets dragged directly into the base of the SALM and gets wedged. At the surface, the crane winds in the cable, and at 12:20, when it finally surfaces, all they get is a severed cable and the bell is lost again. Richard and Victor would have heard the cable snap and felt the bell drop into the sand. It took the ship almost 2 hours to realize they had lost the bell again. Now, in the water, Eddie Frank was able to relocate the bell and he could see that one of the bell's drop weights had been cut. He assumed this was done by Richard and Victor. If they'd succeeded in cutting all the drop weights, the bell would have been positively buoyant and could float to the surface. To cut the drop weights loose, the divers would have had to come out of the bell and into the freezing water. This move now added to the speed of the onset of hypothermia. but they're desperate men. Unfortunately, they only cut one free, and so the bell is still negatively buoyant and sitting in the sand. Eddie could see they were very weak and obviously in desperate need of medical attention. Phil and Eddie themselves are nearing exhaustion, and so they are brought back up to the surface. A new team of divers are sent down. Rescue divers Michael Mangan and Tony Slayman. Just after 1800, after battling against the same conditions that Phil had to, Michael finally connects a new sling to the bell. Then at 1930, pushing towards 24 hours after the Wildrake bell went into the water, and much to the relief of everyone on deck, the bell is finally brought back on board. That relief is short-lived because Richard and Victor are dead. Brian Masterson, the owner of Infabco, who runs the saturation diving operations, orders the divers back into the water to continue working on installing the SALM. Shocked by their orders from someone who seemed insensitive to the death of his own employees, the divers and support crew refused, and instead they began the 6-day process of decompressing the chamber while they waited alongside the bodies of their colleagues. In a crazy twist, Infabco Diving Services are found not guilty of criminal wrongdoing because technically the divers are employed by another company in the Isle of Man. The laws in the UK were later amended to allow an indirect employer to be found guilty, closing that legal loophole. The families of the American divers filed for damages in the US. An LA court awarded Richard Walker's family $475,000, but the British legal system didn't enforce that, and so Infabco didn't pay. The families then filed suit in the UK, which was settled out of court, and Richard Walker's family received $422,000. Victor Giel's daughter received $8,000. A fatal accident inquiry investigated by the coroner in Aberdeen, Scotland, found that removing the clump weight and not stopping the crane to investigate the obstruction when the bell was lodged against the SALM contributed to the deaths of Richard and Victor. Sheriff Douglas James Risk concluded the diving contractors were more concerned with speed than with safety. In a statement to the court, Jean Walker, Richard's wife, read an excerpt from his diary written on the 7th of August 1979 from inside the habitat, hours before he and Victor went into the bell.
The 7th of August, he wrote that he was on location at Thistlefield. The boat heaves a lot. Roger, that was one of the other men in saturation, says there are conger eels all over. We'll find out today. Poor topside management. I know that the only reason why he was still there was because of us, and that's hard to look at. He says, I miss my little one. It really carves a hole right out of me. He says, I don't even know if I'm going to get out alive.